Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Nick. Welcome back to our Let's Read of the Sympathizer. Today we're going to be going through chapter 4. This chapter is absolutely jam-packed. It's a little bit over a year's worth of time in the chapter, so without further ado, let's get into it. We'll go through a really broad stroke summary, and then a little play-by-play, and then after that, we'll go through one of the scenes that I thought was just a little bit more important. So here is my broad stroke summary for chapter 4. Hardships continue as the group adjusts to refugee life on Guam. The general suspects a spy in the ranks. The sympathizer, Bone, and the general with his family find a new home in Los Angeles, California. The sympathizer gets a job in the Department of Oriental Studies at Occidental College, and the sympathizer ruminates on the Vietnamese immigrant experience in America. So like I said, there's a lot that happens in this chapter. I think it probably is the longest chapter in the book so far. It's about 21 pages. It's about 21 pages. Whereas I think before that, the longest chapter was about 15 to 20. Yeah, it's about 21 pages, whereas I think before that, the longest chapter was about 15 pages. So we get a lot of information in this chapter. There's not really a whole lot of excitement that happens in this one. It's a lot of kind of conversations and events that kind of lead to where the real meat of the story, I think, is going to be taking place. Yeah, this chapter was, I think, pretty good. A little bit less good than chapter 3. It's hard to kind of follow a chapter like chapter 3 up with anything. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of really great moments in this chapter, a lot of really great stuff in this chapter. So let's get into a little bit of a play-by-play summary. So to start out, we return to the group at the refugee camp on Guam, where because of the general's position, they live in relative comfort. They receive barracks for themselves, kind of cordoned off from the rabble, more or less. After watching news coverage of the fall of Saigon, the general attempts to boost the morale of the refugees. This scene, I think, is really awesome. Much to his surprise, he is met by the rage and depression that most of the evacuees are experiencing. The group assault the general, accosting him with questions like, "Where is my son? Where is my brother? Where is my husband?" And then they proceed to attack him with house slippers, canes, and hats. Spit on him a few times, which is pretty gross, but I feel like this is a totally warranted and understandable expression of these people's feelings at this point. You know, I think that this is a totally valid response to their situation as it stands. The sympathizer leads the general to safety. They go to the showers, away from the angry mob, and the ashamed general states that they will never speak of the experience again, and they don't. Following day, Lynn and Duke are buried. Bone makes a scene at the funeral, throwing himself into their grave and weeping over their caskets. The sympathizer, once again, is forced to drag his companion back from the brink. The two fill the grave, and the sympathizer reflects on the nature of the soul leaving the body, something that his father, the Catholic priest, believed in, but something that he himself is not able to. The group spends a few more days on Guam and is then shuttled to Camp Pendleton in San Diego, where they are once again forced to hurry up and wait. The sympathizer begins writing letters to Mon's aunt in Paris using predetermined code phrases to alert Mon to the hidden messages found within the letters. The general and the sympathizer pass time in their barracks in Camp Pendleton, where the general is less than satisfied with their living conditions. Multiple families crammed into two small quarters, people having sex with children around, domestic disputes, and more bring the general great pain, but there is some good news, says the general. He produces a newspaper clipping regarding a former associate committing suicide in front of the monument that the general saluted in front of the National Assembly, and the sympathizer responds with, "That's good news." And the general says he was a real hero. The sympathizer recalls crossing the man's name off the evacuation list, and he feels a slight tickle of guilt at this. The general begins to grill the sympathizer about the possibility of an NVA spy in their midst. The sympathizer obviously is trying to play it cool because he is the NVA spy, and successfully deflects suspicion onto a crapulent, which I didn't know what that meant. It means drunk. Major, that evacuated with the group. The general is unsure and makes it known that the sympathizer's instincts may be off for once. So the sympathizer, finally, after receiving sponsorship from a former professor from Occidental College and an associate of Claude, he's able to move out of Camp Pendleton and take up permanent residence in Los Angeles, California. He takes a job as a clerk for the Office of Oriental Studies at Occidental College, like I said, his alma mater. He secures sponsorship for Bone at a local church where he is paid in cash to clean after hours, and the two begin their new life in their Chinatown apartment. The general and his wife also find residence in a Los Angeles bungalow, but the general is mired in a profound funk. The madame takes control of all the menial tasks of household drudgery that, for her cocooned existence, someone else had managed. And one day, the sympathizer receives an invitation to the grand opening of a new liquor store that the general plans to open. The sympathizer goes on to describe his work at Occidental College as the first line of defense against students that sought an appearance with the department chair. His tasks include answering the phone, typing professional manuscripts, fetching books, and assisting the Japanese-American secretary, Miss Mori, who does not seem to like him. I think it's funny whenever he talks about Miss Mori, he talks about her in terms of her physical characteristics, not necessarily her like actual face structure or anything like that, but he says, Miss Mori of the avocado trousers, or Miss Mori of the rhinestone eyeglasses. So I just think that's a funny way of kind of describing her, and helps to paint a little bit better of a picture of her physicality and of her actual character. Department chair is fascinated by the sympathizer, his heritage and culture being somewhat fetishized by the elderly American who has a Chinese wife, I believe, and multiple Amerasian children, as he likes to say. The two meet in the department chair's office and share interesting conversation regarding the Amerasian and the nature of the Occidental versus the Oriental. The department chair requests the sympathizer undertake an exercise in which he compares his Occidental and Oriental nature, and the department chair is fascinated by the responses garnered. Repeatedly referring to the sympathizer as Amerasian, he is finally corrected towards the end of the scene, where the sympathizer asks if him being Eurasian, because he's actually French and Vietnamese, not American and Vietnamese, asks if him being Eurasian would have any influence on the department chair's theory, and to which he responds, absolutely not. So I think that this department chair is a pretty good analog for the kind of the literati of the era. He's a good example of the type of person that was kind of feeling this way and having these conversations. It's a little bit absurd, of course. He's kind of an asshat, for lack of a better term. He's not, he sticks his foot in his mouth a lot, and I think that he's a pretty good example of kind of how silly these types of people are. So the sympathizer and Bowen celebrate their welfare disbursement in their apartment, machine gunning beers into their head, which I think is a really, really hilarious and fantastic way of describing the kind of process that they go through. It's a lot of self-soothing in a negative way. We get a more clear understanding of the cipher used by Sympathizer and Mon for their communication, utilizing the book that Claude gave to the Sympathizer in Chapter 1, Asian Communism and the Oriental Mode of Destruction. They use a mixture of iodine, cornstarch, and water, I believe, to make invisible ink. That then refers to the line, the page, the word, all of that to kind of create the cipher that the two use to communicate. Sympathizer writes a letter to Mon's aunt regarding the tribulations experienced by the expats in the United States following a year in the country. Well, not necessarily exclusively in the country, but since the fall of Saigon. And then he goes on to comment and kind of ruminate to himself on the overall immigrant experience of the Vietnamese refugee in America. And that actually will be our topic of the deep dive for the day. So that's the play-by-play of the chapter. Like I said, there's so much that happens in this chapter. There's so many different kind of locations. We're in Guam, we're in Camp Pendleton, we're in Los Angeles, we're in the apartment, we're in the department chair's office, we're at the college. We're kind of zooming around to all these different places, and I think that this kind of chapter is necessary to kind of set up the next set of chapters. Like I said, I'm a little bit ahead of where we're at right now in the book, and it's kind of a bridge chapter, I want to say, because kind of taking the characters from Vietnam and bridging them to the U.S. to kind of set up their next set of events that they'll be dealing with. But yeah, great chapter. Like I said, hugely important in terms of setting up the narrative for the next little bit. Some really good conversations in here as well. I think all of his conversations with Miss Mori are awesome. I think it's important to see Bone kind of at his absolute lowest. As there's a great segment in here where the Sympathizer talks about how Bone is capable of hitting a bullseye with rifle and pistol, rucking with 80 pounds of kit. He's a soldier, and there's not really a lot of other experience that he has outside of soldiering. So unfortunately, the only way that he's able to make money is through receiving welfare and being paid in cash to clean Pastor Ramon's church. So I think that it's important to kind of see Bone at this low point, so we can then kind of see him start to build himself back up through the next few chapters. So like I said, this kind of Vietnamese diaspora experience in America is the topic of our little deep dive for the day, and we'll get into a little bit more of that. I've got a couple of passages that I'd actually like to read word for word. So yeah, we'll get into it. So on my notes, I titled this passage as the Vietnamese expat experience in America. We get a little bit of an insight into the refugee experience in America following the Vietnam War. The Sympathizer begins by discussing the necessity for sponsorship and the fact that they need to be sponsored in order to leave the camps that refugees were brought to following the war. It could be, people were reaching out to, he talks about how they were reaching out to former employers, former soldiers that were advisors, former lovers, basically anybody that they could get their hands on to sponsor them in order to leave the camp, as well as just reaching out to any church that they felt would take pity on them in order to allow them to enter the country and begin a new life, more or less. We learn more about the diaspora that this parceling out caused. Representatives were received as far east as New York, which in their language or in their tongue they refer to it as Newark, as far north as Chicago, Texas, and California, Los Angeles, Cali. The expats exchange contact information to become the refugee telegraph system to discuss where the best prospects for their people existed. The best welfare checks, the least racist people, the freshest food, best climates, all that kind of stuff. So it's really important, I think, to see that even though this is a novel and this is kind of an embellishment of reality, this chapter I think this segment in this chapter is really, really valuable. And I know I keep saying that it's valuable as a historical document, but I really think that that's true. Great novels, I think, are really able to blur the lines between fiction and reality, and this segment right here, I think, is a perfect example of that blurring. The Sympathizer waxes poetic about the possibility of a sort of new nation of Vietnamese refugees, a little Saigon, that would be self-sufficient and capable of producing everything needed and not needed by a country of expatriates. That's what he said. Doctors, writers, murderers, thieves, if allowed to germinate, Little Saigon would be as delightful and delirious as the original. A line in this segment that I think is really important is when he says, wherever we found ourselves, we found each other. I think that that's really valuable to kind of understanding the refugee experience, not only for the Vietnamese at this time, but for refugees in general. You know, there's a reason why we have Chinatowns, and we have, I live in an area in Florida where there is a Little Saigon. So there are a lot of Vietnamese expatriates here. It's important to understand that when groups of people kind of are forced to leave a certain place, they like to settle in groups in order to kind of alleviate the stressors of adjusting to a new area, a new country for the most part, and I think that this is a really great example of that, and kind of helps to showcase that in a way that's less textbooky. You know, it's not quite as boring to read about, because, you know, we're invested in these characters, and because of our investment in these characters, we're invested in their interests and, you know, their opinions and all that kind of stuff. So I think that this is a super valuable segment in order to kind of paint the picture of the Vietnamese experience, and to kind of show us why the Sympathizer is continuing to maintain his course of action. You know, he feels like he's unable to kind of escape this fate that all of the Vietnamese refugees are experiencing. So, you know, he's just another member of this diaspora, this group that had to flee their homeland because of the Vietnam War, and try and settle in a new land and make the most of it. So the Sympathizer goes on to recount some of the fates of the refugees who made it to America, commenting on the highs and the lows experienced by these immigrants. This part is really, really awesome. It's a single sentence, I think, that goes on for maybe an entire page in total. It's really amazing writing, and it's also really helpful in kind of understanding the good things and the bad things that these people were experiencing at this time. And like I said, it's important to kind of paint the picture of society as a whole for these people at this time. There is a segment that I would like to read word for word, just to kind of show the psychology of the refugees. This is right after the Sympathizer talks about the kind of hardships of the Vietnamese immigrants, and kind of the fact that it's hard for them to find good fish sauce. You know, it's hard to find things that remind them of home, really. But this is him discussing the nature of their refugee status, and the fact that they are now, quote unquote, safe in the United States. He says, "But out of deference to our hosts, we kept our feelings to ourselves, sitting close to one another on prickly sofas and scratchy carpets, our knees touching under crowded kitchen tables on which sat crenellated ashtrays, measuring time's passage with the accumulation of ashes, chewing on dried squid and the cud of remembrance until our jaws ached, trading stories heard second and third hand about our scattered countrymen." So I think this is a good indicator of the way that a lot of these people were feeling at this time. You know, I think that they're dealing with an immense loss. A lot of them, this is the first time that they've left the country. This is the first time that they have really ever experienced life outside of Vietnam, life in a new land. You know, it's much, much different to the life that they were living when they were living in Vietnam. There's a bit of a transitional line where the Sympathizer is talking about how even the poorest houses in the United States have running water and electricity and all that kind of stuff. So this segment as well, he's talking about why he still feels so poor, even though he has these kind of luxuries that weren't really around for people in Vietnam at the time. But I think that this is a really good indicator of why they were kind of dealing with this emotional turmoil. You know, they were not really comfortable in the United States when they first got there, and they're trying to adjust at this point. And I feel like the Sympathizer is kind of a distillation of a lot of these feelings of, displacement and alienation. And I think that it's super valuable as a historical document, again, like I said, to understand that this is based on reality. These are things that were really happening. These are experiences really had by these people at this time. It makes me a lot more sympathetic, to the struggles experienced by these people, and not just these people at this time, but refugees in general. It's hard to leave your homeland in search of a better life, in search of an opportunity to survive, really, because that's what a lot of these people were doing. It wasn't because they were just tired of living in Vietnam and decided to shake things up a little bit. It was because they felt like they needed to escape in order to survive. It should make the reader more respectful to the struggle, to the strife and the hardships and all of that these people were experiencing at this time and throughout history. It's not like people are leaving. It's not like people are coming to another country just because they want to experience the weather. At least in this context, people were coming to the country in order to survive, and I think that that's the most important thing to kind of understand and be sympathetic about when thinking about refugees and the refugee experience, especially in the United States. So I think that that's it for chapter 4. Like I said, it's kind of a bridge chapter between the events of chapter 3 and then the more excitement that we kind of get back into in chapter 5. Super important, but unfortunately there isn't a ton of hair-raising excitement or, situations where I felt super jazzed and excited to talk about every little interaction that's happening. I think that some of the scenes are really, really great. All the stuff with the general and the Sympathizer on Guam, as well as their interactions when they get back to the States. The stuff about Bone and his kind of descent into this depression that he's dealing with, as well as the Miss Maury stuff and the department chair at Occidental College. I think that all that stuff is really great. This chapter does feel like a little bit of a bridge. We'll be getting into chapter 5 next, and that's really, I think, when the ball starts to get rolling a little bit more. Let me know what you thought about this chapter. If you thought it was good, if you thought it was bad, if you thought it was boring, if you thought it was exciting. Just let me know what you thought. If you got any comments or suggestions, of course, let me know. I will go ahead and throw my Goodreads into the description one more time as well, just so it's there. Of course, don't feel pressured to click it. This chapter was pretty good. I'm looking forward to the next one, where we start to really get into the kind of espionage thriller segment of the book. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.